Welcome to the cult bar, everybody. Hey, Renee, how are you?
Hot and allergic to life, but mostly good.
Fair.
You hear me sniffling a lot? I apologize, but this is my life right now.
Okay. Well, glad we're here to talk about our things tonight. So I know you're not having drinks tonight because of allergies and all that good stuff. So why don't we, as I get ready to bring it up here, talk about your drink that you were going to have since you've had it before.
Yes. This is actually a variation on one of my favorite cocktails. There's a restaurant and bar in Palm Springs called, oh gosh, I forgot. Anyway, it's really good. And this is as close as I could get to figuring out what the heck they were making there, because I'm not a big fan of banana liqueur, but this with mezcal and banana, and I can't remember what the other ingredient is. Oh, it's too little. This one has rum. I think the one there has rum as well, but it's not quite the same as the restaurant one, but it is a good at-home dupe, and I love it, and it's delicious, and I wish I was drinking it, but I had to take Benadryl, so if I had a drink, I would fall asleep, and Doug would have to do the show by himself. Mm-hmm. So I'm drinking an energy drink and water.
Well, Benadryl can help in different ways, so maybe not quite as fun as having a drink.
Candy apple crisp bang.
Bang. Yeah, that's something I definitely can't have.
Right to your heart, yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm going with is I got this purely for the name. Girls' Night In. I saw that and I was like, that's such poor taste, but also perfect.
There's so many poor taste cocktails you could have had, because I saw them all today when I was looking, and I was just like, could not bring myself to do like Killer Kool-Aid or Jonestown Punch. I just couldn't do it.
Jonestown Punch, oh my word. Wow. All right. So this has Moscato vanilla vodka, which I didn't have vanilla vodka, and I wasn't about to buy a whole bottle of vanilla vodka because that is vile. I just used regular vodka and strawberry soda, and I got like one of those Goya strawberry sodas. And here's what it looks like. It is pretty bright.
Yeah.
It smells like medicine. So this is going to go great.
Yeah.
Tastes like medicine too.
Great.
Glad I have a whole glass of that.
So we're both taking medicine today.
Yeah, I'm just taking mine with a slightly more alcohol than yours, apparently. So, yeah. All right. Next up, why don't we do some news?
So I'm super excited about this one because I had no idea this person existed. There is a woman on the internet who calls herself Nicole Unicron, or Angelic Technology. That's a name, Angelic Technology, as you can see on the screen, who is a pop star from another planet, born to parents who met while working in a nuclear bomb facility, and she's going to change the whole world into a unicorn utopia. And I love everything about this. But apparently she's switching to a self-help grift. She's trying to make money on this. And if you get into reading what they talk about in this article and some or if you go find her on TikTok or whatever, a lot of talking about the 3D world, like we saw with Mother God.
Yeah.
It's fun because it's like, oh, you can't get what you want with materialism. Pay me money to tell you more about it. But I do like the idea of a unicorn cult.
Yeah,
we've got so many alien cults. Why not a couple unicorn ones?
Yeah, I like that. Her course is $777.77,
down from $2,222.22.
Yes,
angelic numbers from Angelic Technology. I love the name Angelic Technology, but not nearly as much as I love Unicole.
Unicole is great. And she's also using AI to create songs, that's fucking super bad. So fuck that. But
manifest and her Substack is called Step into the Dolphin Abundance Timeline.
Yes. I saw
Which,
that.
yeah, I do. I want to step into the Dolphin Abundance time. I want to see what that's about.
Yeah, not in a JD Vance looking up dolphins way, but Lord, I apologize. That was bad.
Look, this is how you get me into a cult, though. She's like, what we're going to do is there's going to be unicorns, there's going to be dolphins. And I'm like, oh, like, it's my Lisa Frank binder from the 5th grade. I want it. Let's do this. I had so many unicorn pictures in my childhood bedroom. This was made for me. Unfortunately, because of my interest in cults, I know too much to fall for it. So
yeah. Well, that's not unfortunately. That's a good thing because then you're not in it. So
yeah. But I'd love to believe in the dolphin abundance timeline.
Well, you can believe if you would like. All right. Well, I never heard of that either, so that's going to require a little bit more investigation, I fear.
Yeah, I'm sure I won't like what I find when I dig deeper, but I'm loving the idea of a unicorn cult with dolphins somehow involved, and yeah, it just sounds great.
Yeah, it does. It's definitely interesting.
Needs to get in touch with the Unarians.
Oh yeah, space unicorns and space dolphins.
Now we're really hitting all of the high points of the Lisa Frank school supply.
The Scholastic Book Fair cult.
Yeah. Oh, I would join that one. I would.
I think we all would. A little too much nostalgia there. All right. So this week, this month, actually, we will be talking about Jonestown. We're going to do a 3-episode arc of Jonestown because there's a shit ton to talk about with Jonestown.
There really is.
I mean, I think it's inarguably the biggest one, the biggest cult.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe not from membership, but from impact. Yeah.
Yeah. So we both really disliked this documentary, which that's going to make this episode interesting.
For sure.
It doesn't really tell you anything about Jonestown as a cult. So I guess like maybe that's where where we should start is our trigger warnings.
Yes, please do.
We're going to be talking about spiritual abuse, faith healing, and they didn't get too much into exactly how far he went with it, but I'd like to talk about it because it was pretty bad. We're going to be talking about sexual abuse. We're going to be talking about infidelity. We're going to be talking about drug abuse. We are going to be talking about suicide and coerced suicide, which is another word for murder. I understand, but this documentary kind of doesn't address that, which I didn't enjoy. And honestly, like, I think this one's kind of hard because there's so much about Jonestown that is baked into our culture that's actually in really poor taste, but it's so baked in that we don't really notice anymore when we make jokes about drinking the Kool-Aid, stuff like that. So I just feel like a general like content warning, and please forgive us if we slip into some of that, because while I try really hard not to be glib about Jonestown, I lived in our culture for like 35 years before I knew anything about Jonestown, and I got all of that embedded in. So,
yeah.
Oh, and we'll also be talking about, race relations, integration, racism. That's also in there. So,
Yep. Agreed. So good call on all the trigger warnings. So, okay. And as you said, neither of us really care for this documentary for a variety of reasons. This was one neither of us had seen before. So, we kind of rolled the dice and came up snake eyes on this one. But there's still things to discuss about it, at least. So, yeah.
So what I would, I guess, like to do before we jump in, because this documentary just sort of treated it like it was like there wasn't a lot of coercion or control. And they didn't give a lot of history on the cult, which the history of Jonestown is fascinating to me. So where I think I'd like to start is just to talk about a little bit about what I know about how it started. And unfortunately, I thought the documentary was going to be better, so I didn't go back to my original source material, which is Jeff Gwynn's book, The Road to Jonestown. Amazing book. So much detail, so many things that you're not going to find anywhere else. But if I get something wrong, that's 100% on me, not on Jeff Gwynne, because I haven't read it in a while. And I'm going to try and read it before our next episode so that I'm a little bit more up on it in case the next one sucks. I don't know. Hopefully it doesn't. So People's Temple started in Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, one of the things that really drew people to it is there was a lot of, and we see this in some evangelical churches now, there's a lot of like, the suffering you're going through now is like your payment to get into heaven and have a wonderful afterlife. And because a lot of churches preached this, there wasn't a lot of activism in Black churches, and there was no real integration in white churches. And so a lot of disenfranchised Black people didn't have a place to go to get help, arguing with their landlord, figuring out what they were entitled to benefits wise, having someone stand up for them and help them navigate complex social services and things like that. Jim Jones steps in. He's very charismatic. He has one of the first integrated churches, and he says basically, screw all of that. We're here in this life now. We are going to make a difference. And so a lot of the people in the original People's Temple in Indiana joined because they wanted to make a difference. And the white membership was encouraged to not just integrate, not just be friends, but actually get in there, get their hands dirty, and make a difference in their Black congregants' lives. And I have to admit, when I was reading the book and I was reading about all the things they were doing, because there was more social justice to it than just that. But like I said, I haven't read the book in a while. I don't want to like misquote anything. I have to admit that I was like, if I heard about this church, I would want to know more.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
I'd be interested in a positive way. I'd be like, wow, okay, So, and there's a lot to come to terms with on that, because we also know that Jim Jones was kind of a sketchy person pretty much his entire life. But in this particular instance, what the church was doing was objectively good work. And when they moved to California, they did that with the intention of creating an integrated community. And they did. They bought basically a whole neighborhood. They moved black and white in to houses next door to each other. It pissed people off. This was not normal. This was not okay. And they were, again, doing objectively good things. Unfortunately, by this point, Jim Jones had a taste of the power. He began doing drugs. He began referring to himself as God. He began doing faith healings, which a large portion of the membership of the church knew was false, because he was using church members to do it. We're talking about things like, I don't know if you saw the Andy Kaufman movie where like the faith healer is like slipping raw chicken out and pretending that it's pulling tumors out and stuff like that. He was doing that level of fake faith healing. And the reason he was getting away with it is because everything else the church was doing was so positive. And people were willing to excuse the weird shit. By the time they were in California, he was already expressing violence. He was already on drugs. He was already making massive abuses of power. And back in Indiana, he had already made friends with and visited another cult leader, MJ Devine. And we see some of the cult control tactics MJ Devine used at play in Jonestown in Guyana once they moved there. So there seems to have been a plan from the beginning on Jones's part to get it to what it became in Guyana, in Jonestown. And I think all of that's really important now going into this, because when you're scratching your head wondering, why did these people follow him to California? Why did they follow him to a jungle in South America?
Yeah.
The tangible positive effects existed from the beginning. And once that started to fall apart, they were already so deep in it that, they lived in Guyana. They lived in a foreign country and were completely dependent on him. And the documentary does cover, he took a lot of mistresses. It does talk about one custody battle that happened with people who left, but what it doesn't talk about is that he fathered children with many of the female members, and there were many of them who didn't know if Jim Jones was the father or their spouse was the father. And he actually used the threat of keeping those children if the parents left as a control tactic, which they don't really talk about in the documentary. They make it sound like there was one isolated incident. And he, much like we talked about with David Koresh at Waco, there's going to be this thing happening. We're going to have to fight. That was going on at Jonestown from the beginning as well. That started in California. The government doesn't like what we're doing because we're integrating, because we're mixing races, because we're creating this utopia. We're threatening their status quo. They're going to come for us. They're going to take our children. So it's important to know that as well, because this documentary just sort of assumes that nobody was under undue influence or control. And that was very upsetting to me as somebody who's like, no, the human brain is so wired for survival that without, very serious mental illness, like we won't allow ourselves to kill ourselves. So yes, they were brainwashed. Yes, they were in a cult. And another thing that they gloss over is that it's called the Jonestown Massacre, not because it was a mass suicide as it was originally reported, because these people were forced to drink it. They initially did not believe that they were getting poisoned because Jim Jones was doing this all the time. Doing these drills, making them think it was going to be poison, and then it wasn't. And people got very lulled into a false sense of security. So when they gave and it's not Kool-Aid, it's Flavor Aid, when they gave that to the kids and the kids actually started dying, that was a massive surprise for those people. And they did the kids first, which again, that'll encourage people to want to die, unfortunately. But they were held at gunpoint. People who refused to drink were injected. They found needle marks on many of the congregants, many of the dead. This was not a voluntary thing on the part of most of the people involved. And that's another thing that the documentary they kind of mentioned that there was control. They kind of mentioned that people were injected, but they don't really talk about the fact that this was flat out murder.
There's a lot of shit that this documented, like a lot of things you mentioned at the top with Indiana and going to California and all the things that actually were going on behind the scenes. They just flew right past that. Oh, it was a good thing in Indiana, and then they moved to Northern California.
Yeah,
and then we're just being integrated, and we're just doing all this stuff, not talking about all the shit in the background. They never mentioned MJ Devine. They never mentioned any of that shit, and it was just, this is part of the reason you and I were both really disappointed with how they approached this documentary. And the other thing is, as you mentioned when we were chatting about it, is it's basically two people's perspective with a handful of other, well, three really, if you talk about, they did have his son, Jim Jones's one son involved.
Yeah, and he was basically the only nuance in the whole thing, was that he spoke about what his experience. What we got was this one author who had a point of view that is, I would say, significantly different from the point of view of most historians who've covered Jonestown. Just as somebody who's read a lot on the topic, I wouldn't say it's like, I would be ready to believe what she had to say if she brought me any reason to believe what she had to say. That's what I would say. And she really didn't. Yeah.
And they had the sister of two of the women who were quote unquote in the inner circle, and she had never been a part of this. So her stuff was largely conjecture. I mean, you need some opinion stuff when you're doing documentaries, especially with family members, but it was just these 3 points of view and wildly different than what the consensus is for things are for that.
Well, and the thing that I didn't like also is that I know it was widely reported that there was only one survivor of Jonestown at the time, but I understand that that might not be accurate. So when we had former members, they didn't actually tell us if those people were present or not. And I don't think that they were. I know his son wasn't. His son was on a trip with the People's Temple traveling basketball team when this all happened. Yeah. I know that. But the two former members that they spoke to, we don't know if they were there.
Yeah, we don't know. And they did say at the very tail end of the thing that 87 people survived. So.
Oh yeah. Okay. So I missed that. I was.
You were so angry at the end, you just rage shut it off.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was right before the credits. It was just like a little blurb at the bottom. 87 people survived, and then they went right to credits. So now, is that accurate?
It's really hard to know, because honestly, I feel okay. I just say this, like when we talk about science, right? We say like big claims need big evidence. Like the crazier your claim is, the more evidence you need. And
Right.
I'm not saying that her claim is crazy, but it is a vastly different perspective on the events than other historians. And basically what she brought to support that were a handful of lines from written letters and opinions of people who weren't there.
Yeah.
They
a
also said
a lot of unsubstantiated claims.
well, and they also implied that we like didn't know what Jim Jones thought or was thinking about what was happening, and we do because he recorded everything. Like these guys always do. So that really miffed me. I feel like I feel like they back you into a corner where you kind of have to believe that the stuff they left out on purpose. Because if they included it, it would get in the way of the point they were making.
Yeah, and we should say that the point they're making, just by the title, is basically saying that the women were actually had a heavy hand in all of this. And
I believe that they did, but multiple times, Marie Maga, the author, the person making this claim, says that the responsibility lies solely at their feet or primarily at their feet. She says it multiple times throughout the documentary, and that the power for a while between these women and Jim Jones was equal both ways, and then in the end they had power over him. She does nothing to support that.
No. And she says very plainly that, as you said, like it was like they said it like it was an exchange, like Jim Jones slept with you and ergo you have equal power in that. And that is not how that dynamic worked at all.
No.
It's a power dynamic. Jim Jones was the leader. If you slept with him, yeah, you might get some preferential treatment, but you weren't in power.
Well, and it's like, but again, by not talking about the evolution of it as a cult and the evolution of him as a cult leader, we're not understanding one, the spiritual coercion with like being chosen by the leader, this person who you believe is God, or at least believe is akin to God. And then we're not talking about in Guyana that being in his inner circle was actually a survival tactic. And that doesn't excuse any, like, we talk about this all the time. You're complicit in the events and you're responsible for the things that you do. I'm not excusing these women at all. But it's important to understand how they got where they were. And it was a survival tactic. And people do horrible things to survive in horrible situations, and these women did. But their kids got fed when the other kids didn't get fed. They got fed when other people didn't get fed. They didn't have to do hard labor. They didn't have to sleep in the bunks. Like, they were protected by their relationship to Jim Jones. And I really genuinely believe that a lot of the women that he had relationships with did it for that reason. But they were only protected up to a point because they died alongside everybody else.
Yeah, and not every one of them that he slept with was elevated to some sort of position of safety. I mean, that's not true either. So
right. They had to provide a service to him, which again, it's not an exchange of power if you have to perform slave labor in order to have the power.
Yeah. And again, it's similar to something like if you're in prison and you get a certain job and that's sort of a benefit because you're out of the cell block, that's viewed as a benefit. That's not power. All that is you are just doing slightly better than the other people.
Right. And if you do get some sort of power from it, it is because the system is corrupt, not because you've been gifted with power, right? Like if you use your position as the lunch lady to give like the meanest lady in the prison more food so she's nice to you, yes, you have a little bit of power because now she doesn't want to beat you up, or maybe she'll do a favor for you. But at the end of the day, she could still decide to kill you and you're still in prison. Like,
yeah, and you can't escape. You're there.
Yeah.
Well, you can escape. I guess people have done it, but you know what I mean? Generally,
it's not easy. It's not easy. And I think that like that's actually a really good like allegory for what's happening in Guyana. pretty much the whole time, but especially towards the end, which is like, yeah, like maybe you had it better than everybody else. Maybe you had some semblance of power, but you were still stuck in Guyana. And this all was kicked off because one person escaped.
Yep.
One person escaped, and a congressman came to visit, and Jones knew he had to put on a show. People are free to leave if they want. Another thing they don't talk about in the documentary is that the two groups of people who were leaving with the congressman had to slip him notes. They did not just get to say, yeah, we'd like to leave. They weren't even putting on that kind of show. They knew under orders, you say you're happy to be here and you say you don't want to leave. They slipped him notes. And then what kicked it off is they're going to leave, and other members of the People's Temple murdered the congressman and the people who were leaving with him, and then went back. And that's when the mass suicide massacre occurred.
Okay. Well, the documentary makes it seem as if the Guyanese government folks were the ones that gunned down the congressman and the people escaping. And it makes me wonder, again, have far more knowledge on this subject than I do, but they slipped him a note and he presented Jim Jones a note. They show that video of him and being like, well, okay. And Jones just acted like that was normal and that was fine. If they want to leave, feel free to leave. But he knew, because there was one person who got out, and that person got out and just started spilling all the beans.
Yep.
And the thing is there was all kinds of speculation and all this different stuff, but and a handful of people got out and talked about it, but they didn't really have any sort of smoking gun. And the person that escaped was pretty high up in his organization.
The other thing I want to say about the woman who escaped, she was in the inner circle. Throughout this whole documentary, they talk about the mistresses, the secretaries, and his nurses. She was one of the secretaries. And when she escaped, she did not say, they are crazy, they're going to kill everyone. She said, he is crazy, he is going to kill everyone. And they show that video and then go right back to the inner circle was responsible for everything. She was in the inner circle and she got out and she said it was him.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all right. So I'm trying to figure out how to organize this, because everybody has heard so far that we are very displeased with how this was presented. And I think it's not shot well. It's not directed well. It's sort of rudderless.
Yeah.
It's just, take our advice and just kind of skip this one. There's plenty of documentaries you can watch about Jonestown. This is one you can completely skip because you get a very skewed perspective that doesn't have facts to back it up.
One of my notes is, what the fuck is this doc doing? So yeah.
Yeah,
it's hard because when we do these shows, we present what the documentary presents as fact.
Yes.
Because that's our source. And kind of knowing that they didn't support their facts, and some of the things presented were like the sister of two of the women who had never been to Jonestown, never met Jim Jones, never met anybody involved except for her sisters, is talking as an expert on what happened. And it's like, well, just being related to somebody doesn't make you an expert on what happened in a different country among people you've never met. That's not enough.
Yeah, yeah, and you can infer what you want from letters and communication, but that's an inference. You're not there.
Well, there were times where she was speaking, like she was narrating the events as though she was an expert on the events. And I was like, that's irresponsible. And the other thing is they asked her what Marceline, Jim Jones' actual wife that had been with him since the beginning in Indiana, what she got out of basically allowing him to cheat. And it's like, well, she wouldn't know. And from what she said about what her sisters wrote to her in the letters about Marceline, they didn't give her any theories either. So why are we asking her? Why didn't we ask his son? His son was there.
Yeah, and he talked a bit about his mother, but he didn't but the thing is, he was like 11 or some shit, like when this was all going on. So
Well, he was a teenager, so
yeah. I mean, he might have some inkling, but at the same time, I'm pretty sure just from the way he was playing that he wasn't there all that
no,
as
he wasn't. He was on the traveling basketball team.
Mhm.
And so he had, and other teenagers and adults went with them on this team, and they represented the People's Temple with this team. And that is where he was when this happened. And actually, it would have been great to hear his story in more detail
Yeah.
because he was present when they got word, and he and another adult member of the People's Temple spent the night trying to talk the other adult there out of killing themselves in solidarity. Again, I didn't get to revisit the book, so I don't want to get too much into detail on that because I don't remember all of it. But
Mhm.
he knew that his mother was there and was committing suicide. And he also felt he had a responsibility to the adults he was with to prevent them from doing so as well. And so that's why I say, like, there were some people who definitely were like, yeah, I'll kill myself for this cause. But not all of them by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure there were people that were willing to, you know, go and do this, the taking their own life for the cause. But I think some of that was also due just the conditions that were going on there, and just sort of they made it seem very much like you said, like you mentioned, Waco with Koresh was just the desperation and hey, things are coming and it's going to be bad. And I think that played very heavily into people being like, "Yep, I'm not going to. I'd rather with how bad this is, and I have nowhere to go. I'm in the middle of the jungle. I have no way of getting anywhere." That's desperation, you can see
So,
that.
well, there's a few things, right? So there's that, and I firmly believe that played a role in a lot of people's decision. There's that. There's the fact that he ran the drills, and so it got to a point where people didn't believe that he was ever really going to give them the poison.
Mhm.
And then there was the fact that they were told that if they did it, it would be painless. And they instructed them, and they do mention this in the documentary, to give it to the children first. And it's kind of just like in the documentary, um, I think you need to sit with that information for a minute because they were told it would be painless and they were told to give it to the children first. When they gave it to their children, they didn't know there was poison in it. They had no reason to believe this wasn't another drill. They did not know that the congressman had been shot. Um, and death by cyanide poisoning is not painless. It is really, really disgusting, really painful, and very hard to watch.
Right.
So by doing that, what do you do? Like if you handed your kid that cup, now you really have nowhere to go and no reason to want to.
Yeah. The
You're going
one
to go
part.
back to America and face charges for murdering your child, knowing, and
Yeah. I mean, one person, I forget who had said it, but it was after you kill your child, what means do you have for living? Like you were
right.
complicit in your child's death. Like if I was complicit in one of my kids' death, I'm not sure how I would move on. Like,
And just even if the people, and I'm sure that among the people who gave it to their children, there were people who would have gladly done it if they knew
mhm,
exactly what was going on because it was a cult and we see this kind of behavior over and over again. But in gladly doing it, they also believed that it would be painless and they had to watch their children die a really violently horrible death. And that is going to really fuck with morale. It's really going to fuck with your desire
sure.
to stand up against what's happening. Like if you thought of yourself as a person who's like, well, I was here for the social justice. I was here because I believe we could build a utopia. But now that we're killing ourselves, I'm out. You just watched 300 kids die convulsing with foam coming out of their mouths. And it's part of the group you're involved in. That changes things.
Yeah.
And
And yeah, when you're in the middle of that stuff, traumatic situations can make your brain go haywire in a lot of different ways. So, like, how everybody's going to react different because everybody's brain chemistry and thought process is different. Even if you're brainwashed, that might trigger some people, and other people will be like, "Yep, here we go," and other people might be like, "Well, I got no reason to live."
Well,
Like,
and the thing is if it's truly a mass suicide and everybody volunteered, we wouldn't have needed to be held at gunpoint, which they were, and we would not have needed to inject anybody with cyanide, which they did. So we do know that there were people who either were never going to kill themselves, or who, once they saw it in action, snapped out of it and were like, "I'm not doing that." But they were murdered.
Yeah.
And we don't know how many people drank it by gunpoint. We don't know that.
Yeah.
It could have been half. It could have been 2/3. It could have been 10 people. But we know that they were held at gunpoint because we have the recordings.
Yeah. And they do have some of the recordings, and it's just like where you could hear some of the kids like in abject pain, and like them telling, just keep them calm and have them be quiet, and it'll be painless. And they keep telling them
And
that
they're
it's going
not
to be painless.
crying because it hurts. They're crying because it tastes bad, was the other line that they were told. But you can tell.
Yep.
By the way, just like if you're very interested in Jonestown, you read the books, you watch whatever, I'll tell you two things. Those recordings of the entire massacre are out there, freely available, and I don't suggest you listen to them. I have never listened. I've only listened to clips that have been in other things like in this, which were not very graphic. The whole thing is out there. Everyone I know who's listened to them, no matter how much experience they have with cult history, is just like, yeah, don't do that. You don't want to. It's bad.
Yeah, you don't want that rattle around in your skull. So, yeah, it's. All right. So, like I said, we have our issues with this documentary. Let's get a little bit of it, though.
Okay.
The focus is on basically 4 women, really, as far as I can tell. And those women were
his wife, Marceline.
That would make 5. That would make 5 from what I have.
Oh, I only have 4 people listed.
So I have no, Marsh, you're right. I have Carolyn Layton, Maria Carsardis, Annie Moore, and Marcelyn Jones.
Right, and Carolyn and Annie are sisters.
Yes,
they married and stuff. So
yeah. So that is the focus of this. They don't really focus on Jim Jones, which is a very odd choice. It's called Jonestown. Like, you'd think that maybe that would be more of the focus, but.
And again, I feel like they left context out because it would challenge their viewpoint.
Yeah. So like you said, they do say at the beginning, and they gloss over a lot of shit, of course, but the idea that their platform was like, we're for social justice, we're for integration, we're for bringing everybody in. And they did do a lot of recruiting, and they called it that, in poor areas to try to bring people of color in and all that stuff. And, the idea of helping the poor is a novel idea for some of the churches in this country. Even then. And everything was still highly segregated, even in the 60s. Obviously, there were still, even with equal rights and all that stuff, everything was still highly segregated. So this was sort of new, and people that were progressive, and I could see how the appeal of that would be like, oh, cool, I get to really affect things. This is like social justice and change, and this is important. So yeah, they kind of position it as that's how it is. And as you said, they did some measurable good.
I do think one viewpoint we got from Carolyn and Annie's sister, who I've forgotten her name, but
Rebecca.
Yeah. One viewpoint we get from Rebecca that's really, I think, worthwhile, and I wish they had spent more time on, is that she said the difference in her sisters was Carolyn was very into the religious aspect of it, and Annie was very into the social justice aspect. And I think
it was flipped. I think Carolyn was
sorry,
because Carolyn came in earlier and was all about the social justice, and Annie came in and was like kind of wooed by the religious part of it.
Yes, you're correct. Sorry. But the reason that that's important is because you have to understand that every single point of Jonestown's notable history, or the People's Temple's notable history, that dichotomy was present. There were people who were a part of the People's Temple who were not religious. They were there for the work. And that is in part why Jim Jones got away with some of the wackier shit in California, because they were not offended by blasphemy. They were not offended by fake faith healing if it made money for them to do their activism. They just wanted to make a difference. And that's interesting to me, that some people were more susceptible to letting him get away with really egregious culty stuff because they didn't believe in his religious teachings. Like they felt they had some insulation from it, maybe.
Yeah, but you're still part of something that's, yes, you're getting stuff done, but like, at what point where's your line, I guess?
Yes. And I mean, it's important to note that not everybody went to Guyana. A lot of people stayed in California. And by the time they moved to Guyana, they had the original neighborhood, which was in Northern California. They had stuff in San Francisco and in LA. There were a lot of members, and still back in Indiana, I believe.
They didn't touch on that, but yeah.
There were a lot of members of this church who had no fucking idea what was going on in Guyana.
Well, most of the cults we cover, there's this small circle that's doing a lot of the heinous shit, and a lot of the periphery folks who are low level, a lot of times don't know what the
well, they knew, at least if you lived in Jonestown, you knew that you weren't getting fed well, right? Like you knew that it was kind of falling apart. But the people who stayed behind did not know that.
Right.
They didn't know that it was a failed experiment pretty much from the jump. And I think that's important, because those people still exist, and like they've given interviews in the past and stuff, and you like, well, how could you be part of that church? And it's like, well, they didn't know what was going on in Northern California when he was doing the fake faith healing. They definitely didn't know what was going on in Guyana. They weren't there. It's not like they were on TikTok.
Yeah. And the way information was relayed in those times was slow and and chaotic, and like you were relying on people telling you stuff that you couldn't be sure if that's actually what was happening. Like I
mean, you have to imagine that. My opinion is it's unlikely that mail was leaving Jonestown without being looked at.
Oh, no way. No way. Yeah. You know all that shit, because like most leaders of cults, there's a huge amount of control of everything. Like
information control is the number one thing. Yeah. It's
like people were not allowed to leave. They were not allowed to go outside of the compound. They were not allowed to receive mail. Like, you're right. Like, there's just no way information was just freely going out of that place. He was trying to control all of it, because he knew that he fled Northern California before this article, one of the articles came out, because he knew that would be a backlash, and he got the fuck out because he didn't want to have to face it.
And again, I think there's missing context with how this documentary presented that, because I do believe that affected the timing, but I also believe, and again, I did not get to go back and fact check. This is my opinion, and maybe I'll be able to speak with more authority next month. There was always a plan to do something like Jonestown, and there were reasons that they chose Guyana, which again, didn't get to fact check it. The government was amenable to what he wanted to do. So this was planned. He was talking to the government. Like, he didn't just get on a plane and buy some property. It was a very long process before he went there, and well before anybody else showed up. And so the part where you said they talked about the Guyan, I don't know if it's Guyanese or Guyanan.
I do not know.
Both
sound right.
The government of Guyana was involved in the attack on the congressman and the people leaving. That might be true, but it was because Jim Jones wanted it that way, and there were members of the People's Temple involved in that. So it was something to do with money.
Yeah, it's Guyanese, by the way.
Guyanese. The Guyanese government was very amenable to what Jim Jones wanted to do, and very amenable to looking the other way when things were not how they should have been.
I wonder if they were Guyanese, if they had Flavor Town down there, but sorry.
That's
that's a very bad Guy Fieri joke.
Because there's another town in Guyana that was founded by American expats that I thrived, called Georgetown.
Yeah, which was where Stephen was. That's where he was when the whole thing went down. Now, he was in Georgetown at the basketball thing. That's where he was.
Yeah.
So it's funny that I think it's French Guiana, or is it just Guyana?
I think that it used to be French Guyana, but now it is just Guyana. Kind of like it used to be the Ukraine, but now it's Ukraine because they're no longer part of the USSR.
Yeah, I always thought, like, for some reason, and this is my ignorance, so I apologize. My brain always kind of put Jonestown over in Africa.
Yes.
Because
I have that same problem, and I know that it's not there now, and I still kind of think of it.
For some reason, I was thinking French Guyana was in Africa, and it's when they were like, "Oh, it's in South America." God, why didn't I never look that up? Like one of those things. I just, you know what I mean?
Well, that's kind of what I was talking about at the opening of the show, right? Is like there's so many things baked into our culture about it, like that things about it without knowing them. So, like, you've heard that Jonestown was in a foreign country, and you kind of heard the name, and you're like, "Oh, that sounds African to me," and you just go back to life, and it's in Africa, like.
Yeah, and it's in the jungle, so like, unfortunately, like, this is baked into our societies. We associate a lot of jungle with being in Africa as opposed to South America, which there's a shit ton of jungle in South America.
Yeah.
So like, but that is sort of like a sort of weird Americanization to give you if it's jungle centric, you're going to be in Africa. Meanwhile, there's jungles in Southeast Asia and everywhere, all over the place. But for some reason, our culture kind of tends to associate jungle with Africa, even though a lot of Africa is not jungle; it's desert.
but yeah, I will validate you on that. I believed that so much that even though I have known better for at least a decade, if not longer, I still have to like correct myself in my mind when I talk about it, that it's not in Africa, it's in South America. So you're not the only one. Maybe we're the only two. I'm sure people will let us know if that's the case.
Yeah. It used to be French Guiana. So France used to own it. That's why it was French Guiana, and then now it's just Guyana. But
anyway, that's a whole different
colonization, baby. Colonization, baby.
So he took Carolyn as a mistress when they were still in Indiana, according to the documentary. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
I thought it was in California.
Might have been. Okay, because that makes more sense.
But maybe that's wrong.
Yeah, but it does make more sense to me because my understanding of the timeline is that things were pretty chill in Indiana. Mm-hmm. And they rapidly went off the rails in Northern California.
Do you think that has anything to do with better access to drugs?
Yeah.
And it was in the 60s in Northern California. So
I do believe, like I said, I believe that he always had a plan to have absolute power. You can never convince me otherwise. There are a lot of examples from his childhood that would paint it that way. And then also, like, what is your reason for going to a known cult and hanging out with that cult leader and taking notes and then implementing his tactics in your own church if you don't intend to have a cult?
Yeah.
And I believe actually, and again, got a fact, I believe he actually tried to angle for control of Father MJ Divine's church after he died, but it didn't work out.
Yeah. I have a question, though. Father Divine, is that the guy you're referring to?
Yes.
All right. Father Divine is different. Why is it that white cult leaders from this time frame all try to look like Wayne Newton?
I have no idea.
They all have all the wavy hair, the fucking goofy.
I didn't fucking tell you. This is so good, though. I'm so glad you brought it up because I was reading that book well over a decade ago, or around a decade ago, somewhere in that And I got halfway through the book before I realized that I was picturing George Jones the whole time. And then you look up a picture of George Jones next to Jim Jones. It's not that different. I wasn't that far off.
No, but that, like, the thing is like, honestly, with something like that, like George Jones and Jim Jones, like they have Jones is obviously the same. George and Jim, both the beginning consonants sound the same.
Right, and their hair was the same, the glasses.
Fucking stupid glasses. God.
You know how everybody there should have known that it wasn't cool. He wore the glasses while he preached, sunglasses while he preached. Nobody who's up to any good wears sunglasses inside. Definitely not while they preach. And I say
unless
that
unless you're a rapper unless you're a rapper at a sports event, then that's okay.
In my defense, if you see me wearing sunglasses inside, it is because my sunglasses are prescription. And I probably left my glasses in the car or at home.
Or you have a migraine.
Oh, if I have a migraine, I just stay home. But I have this thing, so I don't get them very much anymore.
Yeah.
It actually does work. That's not woo. You heard it here first.
Oh, okay. Well, my daughter gets migraines. What is that piercing called?
It's called a daith piercing.
A daith?
Daith, yeah. And since I've had it, I've had it for 5 or 6 years now. And in that time, I've had a migraine maybe 4 times, and they were so mild that the only reason I finally put together it was a migraine was the location of the pain in my head and the fact that my stomach was a little upset.
Okay. All right. So good to know. That was a good, nice little side quest there. Okay. So like I said, we have there's some things I want to ask you as someone who knows a bit more about this than I do. There's a lot of talk and a lot of concentration, and I don't know why they use this kid's full name like he's a serial killer. John Victor Stone. John Victor Stone was this kid, and the parents left without him, which I know. You go, well, you don't know what it's like. I know, but like, fuck, what are you leaving your kid back if you've left knowing how bad this is?
The problem there, so because they didn't know who the father was, which they do mention in the documentary. They didn't know if Jim Jones was the father or her husband was the father. And I think that they believed they had a better chance of fighting for custody with help from the U.S. than they had from inside the cult. I agree with you. I'd have taken my chances.
I'd have been like, you're coming with me, kid, and we'll fucking figure it the fuck out. Like,
we don't even really understand. Like, they didn't really talk about how they even got out. And I think maybe they got out via negotiation, right? Because it wasn't easy to leave. You had to have a plane, and it had to land on this very specific landing strip that was not owned by it was owned by the Guyanese government. So I wish they had gone into more detail on that, and I wish they had given more context, because again, this was normal in Jonestown, that there were children who he had fathered or who he may have fathered. And he used that as a means to control the mothers of those children.
Sure. And by proxy, the husbands, which, I mean, it just, they made a big deal about this. And part of it is because there was a custody thing that they tried, and they were trying to serve him for custody. And, they made that seem like that was sort of an impetus for his paranoia. His paranoia was way before any of this.
Yeah, I don't think it was an impetus for his paranoia. I think that he was able to take that yarn of truth and weave a whole tapestry for the people in Jonestown. See, I told you, they are coming for our children.
Yep.
That's my opinion. But no. And they, one of the things they say in the documentary is like, well, this was planned. They already had the poison. They'd already tested it. They'd already done this. And it's like, yes, but it was planned way before any of the inciting incidents came along. And he was running those drills, I think even in California, but I could be wrong about that. He's running those drills, and it really, it's the thing is like maybe the first time you line up to drink it, you're like, oh, I can't believe I'm really going to do this. But then you see a bunch of people drink it and they don't die.
Yeah.
By the 10th time that happens, you're like, yeah, he's full of shit. We're not going to die.
Yeah.
I
All
really
right, I'll
think
drink
that
that
played a
thing.
role.
Yeah. All right. So again, that whole thing with the kid really kind of like, I was like, was this really that? Like, I mean, it was a big deal, but not a big deal compared to all the other shit that was going on. I like they really went at this like it was a real thorn in Jim Jones' side, and I was like, I'm sure there was a minor thorn, but it wasn't the biggest thorn he had, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's just one of those things. It's like, well, so it's often presented in this documentary that the women took power from him and made him a figurehead. And that, like, the MAGA actually says at one point that is the point where they stopped serving him and he started serving them. And I'm like, that sounds absolutely bonkers to me, and I would like some evidence of that, which we didn't get. But so they make it out like Jim Jones had planted the seed, but maybe he was full of shit like everybody believed. And these women were like, no, we're going to do it. And so if that's our thesis statement, why does it matter if he was paranoid or not?
By that thesis, the women should be just as paranoid. And she made no case for that in this documentary at all. She made no case that they were just as paranoid. She alternately says that they were responsible, but also didn't say that they were paranoid as well. Like it was just like they were just
like, what is their
motive? And in that case, they were serving Jim, but they were the ones that were responsible, which that does not make any sense at all.
They didn't intend to leave, so they would never be in that situation. It's very weird because I do think that the custody battle had an impact on what happened, on when it happened, not on it happening at all. Just like the two things very close together of somebody leaving and then almost immediately is this congressman coming.
Yeah.
Those two things happening close together. These are all like little fires that were, coming together to create this horrible tragedy. But what is the motivation of this group of women to not let people leave? What is the motivation of these women to kill people? Why are they doing it? We never get that.
Oh, and this Mary MAGA, which, God, what a name. She even makes the point that she thinks she specifically points out Maria, who very clearly was brainwashed as fuck. And she said she wasn't brainwashed. She was one of the major parts of this whole. And I'm like, are you out of your, what are you talking about?
Explain to me how, if you believe that Maria Casares was not brainwashed, explain to me why she was there living that crappy life. Why was she a spokesperson for Jonestown? Why did she kill herself? Even taking away the fact that you're implying that she is personally responsible for the planning and execution of the massacre. Why did she do that if she's not brainwashed? This is what I think bothered me, is it's kind of painting these women, and not Marceline, which is very weird, but these three women as pure evil with no motivation other than evil. And while I believe that what they did is evil, and I believe that they are responsible for their actions and helping to pull it off, they were in a cult and they were under direct influence. The closer you were to Jim Jones, the more influence he had over you.
Yep.
That's how influence works. It's very weird. And I think the only time they mention that Jim Jones thought of himself as God is when his son Stefan is speaking. He said when they first got to Guyana, his mother Marceline pulled him aside, said, we have to isolate him. We have to get him off the drugs. And he said, he told his mother, you can't tell God he has a drug problem. And I thought it was very irresponsible to have that be the only mention of it, because we know he doesn't like his dad, and we know that he holds his father responsible for his mother's death.
Yep.
You have heard people talk about their overbearing, shitty parents like that before.
Yeah.
Where they are not actually saying that their father thought that he was God or told people that he was God. Jim Jones actually told people that he was God, and people actually believed him. That's important here. It's really, that's the whole basis of it being a cult and not just some people on a farm in Guyana.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty clear that he holds his father in a lot of contempt, and he reserves space for his mom because he felt bad for her. And listen, that's his mom. Like, he kind of get it. Like, and I think that she liked what was going on in Indiana. I feel like this is all my opinion. This is not anything based on any sort of fact. This is me thinking that in Indiana, she was like, I'm on board. This is like, he's got a mission. He wants to build this church. He quits his job. They take out a loan to get a church. And she's all on board. She's like, and his vision of being like social justice and all that, which turns out to be just, blather. I think she's on board with it. And then when they get to Northern California, all of a sudden he starts, taking in other women and never divorcing her.
Well, and this is it, right? Is like having your husband's affair flaunted in front of you while he tells everybody that you are so mentally ill that you can't have a normal relationship is some pretty serious abuse.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine her mental state. And that's another thing. Like, we spent all this time on assumptions about Maria, Carolyn, and Annie without exploring some of the things that we just basically know. Some things, like, she was a beloved member of the community. She was called Mother Jones. And then even before they got to Guyana, nobody fucking liked her anymore. When they got to Guyana, they moved her into a separate house across the property, which was huge, from her husband. She had no power. By the time this happened, people didn't even really like her anymore because they didn't see her.
Yeah.
And I think that there's, like, when we talk about how she ended up in that situation and how she ended up in whatever level of complicity that she was in, she was being worn down bit by bit, probably since they were dating. I don't think that happens overnight.
No, that takes a lot of time.
And just chipping away until she was somebody who would think, well, I guess I have to put up with my husband having an affair in front of me and everybody else. And I guess I'll have to move to Guyana with my husband, even though he's sleeping with multiple women.
Yeah. And I think there is something to be said about sort of the idea of, and you see this with, and forgive me, I'm going to use a current political vibe to this. White women voting against their interests because of the proximity to the power of white men.
Yes.
And it felt like that she had proximity to power and she felt taken care of. And
I think we also need to remember it was 1968.
Yeah.
You could get a divorce. Not a lot of people did. And not a lot of ministers' wives did.
Fair.
And what was her work experience? How was she going to support her son? How was she going to feed herself?
Like many women in those times, you were just kind of, well, I'm fucking stuck. So, like, but what I'm saying is, like, the idea of, like, she had power of some sort, like an approximation of power, maybe is a better way of saying it.
Definitely in the beginning, for sure.
In the beginning. And then as more women and Jim Jones kept doing more and more things with other women, her power lessened to the point where she got Guyana and she wasn't even part of anything. The point that people did not like her. So
I
at that
think she thought she could change it.
Yeah. Well, there was something where Stefan said early on that his mom saw the good in him and thought she could model him or mold him.
I can fix him. Yeah.
Yes.
I think that's very true. I mean, it's like when they got to Guyana, she's like, let's get him isolated and get him off drugs. Like, she thought that would make a difference, like, yeah. I don't think it would have.
No. And what is interesting is there was a point where Stefan said that he was like summoned to his like little house in Guyana, and he goes in and Carolyn gives him a shot, and he goes, "Oh, that's just B12," and then immediately he just goes into like
Yeah.
that was not B12. That was now the
There's
one person claimed it's
phenobarbital. Yeah.
it claims it's phenobarbital. Okay, but he was an addict, and he had means to keep supporting the habit. So
Yeah, and that's the thing where it's like they seem to want to, in the documentary, paint the picture that because he was an addict, he couldn't have been in charge. And that's not true if you have access to the drugs all the time.
mhm.
That it's, it just isn't. It happens all the time. And that is like, how you come up with really paranoid nonsensical ideas like we will win by killing everyone. So
Yeah, there's some other things that I have too many notes for something that sucks so bad.
I know.
There was one data point that they made that I don't know. Basically saying that 2/3 of the folks in Jonestown were either children or elderly, which means they couldn't work. So, like, is that factual? It makes a lot of sense to like how conditions are so bad because they know enough people to actually do the work of farming and all that
Yeah,
shit.
I don't know the truth in that. But I also don't know that that means that they didn't work.
Yeah, there was one thing that there's this black lady named Leslie Wagner Wilson who was there with her mother, and her mom at one point tells her, "I am just so tired," and she's like, "She's 50. I'm 52. Like I'm tired, but I'm not like worn down to my nubs."
Right.
But the idea of like if you're 50 and you're that exhausted in the middle of all this because you're being made to work like
Like a
like a
20-year-old. Yeah.
like a 20-year-old and you can't fucking do shit, I could see how that would feel like overwhelming, and maybe an out is an easier path. But what that lady says is later on, she says that I forgive them. And all I could think of is fuck that. Don't forgive people that ran you into the ground, ran your mother to an early grave.
Yeah,
And
I think
I'm going to forgive them. I am I'm a pretty forgiving person in general, but that is not a space where I feel like I could be like, oh, I forgive them. I don't think I could do that.
yeah, I think I think I've talked about this on the show before. I have a real issue with forgiveness culture. I don't think that
Yeah.
you have to forgive to heal. I don't think that's true. And when you listen to people talk about why you need to forgive in order to heal, they're actually not talking about forgiveness. They're talking about other things.
Oh, absolutely.
So yeah, if she does, this is the other thing because, and this is true of every documentary you watch, you're only going to get the parts of those interviews that support the viewpoint of the documentary. And so it is possible that she meant she forgives the women because she's taken time to understand that it's more, there's more nuance in the situation. But we don't know if that's what she meant because we didn't really get enough of her at all. Like that's it. We didn't get enough of anybody who was actually there to know anything about how they felt about what was going on, which is really why have them if you're not going to actually utilize their very valuable insights. And I would say, where did it go? I had a thing here on my notes about that.
I have one thing as you're trying to find that. The idea of forgiveness culture is almost always rooted in religious stuff because religious stuff requires forgiveness for the shitty things people do in the name of religion. And I'm looking at something like basically like look at the Catholic Church. They require you to forgive these people that do unspeakable things to kids within the church. They require forgiveness for those things. And again, maybe it's not a completely religious thing, but religion is where it is most prevalent that I see. There is a forgiveness culture in our country specifically, but I feel like it's largely religious.
Yeah.
Where like if you're in a religion and somebody does some awful shit to you or somebody you care about, well, you need to forgive them because that is the spirit of your heart that you need to forgive them because that's what the religion is all about
No,
is
that's what
forgiveness.
Jesus is for.
And I'm just like, yeah. And I have people in my life who have been abused in many ways from in a religious institution by religious leaders, and they were told they need to forgive those people. And all I keep thinking is, how can you demand that of someone who went through trauma?
And it's just like, oh, you can forgive somebody without letting them back in your life. It's like, well, then I could just move on without thinking about them
Yeah, I
very.
don't have to forgive them. Fuck that. They can figure it out themselves. Fuck that.
Anyway, so here's what I got is there was a quote, I believe you know what, I didn't write who it was, so I'm not going to say. Maybe you'll remember. It says his nurses and mistresses and secretaries caught his insanity. That is the documentary I wish they made.
Yeah.
Um,
I would be much more interested in that.
well, but I think it's true. His inner circle went as he got crazier. His inner circle got crazier, and eventually, these women and whoever it was holding the guns executed this plan, fully knowing what was happening. A lot of the people who were victimized that day did not fully know what was happening, but the women who organized it and the people holding the guns did.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think they were crossbows, not guns, but there might have been both. I can't remember.
Oh, they said guns and crossbows. I think they said
Yeah,
both.
okay. And then so it's like in addition to that, another note I have is things get crazier as Jones gets crazier. There needs to be some consideration for Occam's razor, right? Like if these women are controlling everything, then his level of insanity, his level of paranoia would not have played a role in anything. If they were controlling him, puppeteering him with drugs and everything, like is implied, he wouldn't have been the one on the loudspeaker 24 hours a day.
Yeah, the idea that he was just blaring his stuff out on a loudspeaker, and they said all waking hours. Now, does that mean he had to have slept at some point? But like, maybe he's like some of these cult leaders that just like they sleep 3 hours and then the rest of the day they're just fucking on. Like as a 52-year-old man, I can't empathize with that because it's like it's like 10 o'clock and I'm ready to fucking go to bed. But
Right.
yeah, just the idea of hearing someone just constantly on the loudspeakers would be just so grating and
It's
like
literally a torture
watching.
tactic. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so yeah, so I think there's like, I don't know, like I'm thinking about this and it's the idea that they either have to be wholly responsible or not responsible at all. And I do feel like this sort of works into like this is part of this like idea of you have to forgive everyone. It's like you have to be all good or all bad.
Yeah, things are
So
much
you have
more
to
gray
either
than
be a
that.
victim or a perpetrator. You have to either be good or bad. You have to either, and it's like, no, I think that these women and other people in his inner circle, which we know there were other people, because you couldn't pay a normal person any amount of money in the world to hold people at gunpoint and force them to kill themselves.
Right.
Like there's shit going on if that is something you're willing to do. They were both things. They were the bad guys and they were victims. And it's okay for Jim Jones to be the worst of the bad guys. It's okay. We don't have to take responsibility off of him to say that the people who planned and executed it under his direction were also bad.
Yeah, there is something to like our storytelling culture is a lot of very black and white, good and bad. And the thing is, and I'm going to equate it to fiction, best characters are the ones that are morally gray.
Yeah.
Because that's how people are. Nobody is entirely good and nobody is entirely bad. There's shades to it. It's a spectrum. Every fucking thing in this world is a spectrum, from whether you're good or bad, whether you're gay or straight, whether you are on an identity spectrum for your gender. There's a spectrum to fucking everything. And the idea that like it's just nope, it's good or bad. That's not how it works. Like,
yeah, and I think it's very rare to find somebody who's on either end of the spectrum. And I will
yeah,
say, what I know about Jim Jones' life before, during, and after, or there was no after, he was pretty close to the far
nobody
end.
knows what happened after.
Yeah. Well, if he was right, I have a feeling I know. But anyway,
Yeah.
he was very close to the far end of that spectrum, to the evil end of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
But as we said many times before, if you are drunk, on drugs, under the influence of an abusive partner or a cult leader, you are triggered because you have, PTSD or something. The things you do, you are still responsible for.
Yep.
And so, yes, Annie and Carolyn and Maria talked about, how do we make this happen? We have evidence of that.
Mm-hmm.
We know that they participated, they died. And we know that Annie was perhaps the last person to die on purpose. So yeah, they're responsible for the part that they played. They're responsible for their complicity, but they're not solely responsible. And
right.
I don't believe that they would have done it if there were no Jim Jones. I don't think that if these women had all come together under different circumstances, that they would have killed 1,000 people. I just don't think so.
I agree.
It doesn't make any sense. And the documentary didn't offer any reason for that.
Well, we hear a lot about in these things about sort of like nature versus nurture, which is kind of an imprecise thing. There's other parts to it. There's
a spectrum on that as well.
There's a spectrum as that, yes. So there's also things like choice and then influence, and like there's a lot of like people are not binary in any way. There's too many factors and a lot of different things and how things work. Your brain chemistry is one. Like if your brain is, some people more susceptible to being hypnotized than others. Like there's so many variants to this. Like you can't just say one is this, and one is that.
Right.
Like you could say someone is far more this than they are that. Well, but like you said, Jim Jones is very much on the evil part of that spectrum. I mean, you could throw certain people in that people we've covered on here that are just very much farther on the evil scale than they are and with anything good. Right. I think the beginnings of the People's Temple was actually, you said he probably had a plan from the beginning. He might have, but the intentions that they laid out at the very beginning were good.
And I would say the other thing is that the people that were there at the beginning, were not the people who were helping plan the massacre in Guyana.
Oh no, yeah.
They may not have even been in Guyana, but we don't really know. Like, I don't really know that. But I'm saying, like, I believe, and again, I'm just going to recommend this book over and over again, The Road to Jonestown by Jeff Gwynne. He has a way of getting into the details that other people don't think are important. And once you have them, you're like, oh, that's actually really important, There's a lot of places where you can see in his childhood and when he was a young man that he thirsted for power and he was manipulative. So while the church was doing really good things in Indiana, he was making friends with MJ Devine and trying to connect the churches and taking notes on how to control people from Father MJ Devine. So there's something going on, right? But the people there were there because of what was facing outward.
Right.
And so we can say, like, those people wouldn't have. Yeah. What? By the way, Jerry, I just want to say this. I just finished his book on Waco. And I wish I had read that before we did our series on Waco, because same thing, like the amount of detail. I have heard some very detailed like podcasts and stuff about Waco, and the documentary was really good, but the stuff he got into was just like, wow. And the way he connected it to things that happened afterwards as well. So I recommend his book on Waco as well, and his book on Manson, which is called Manson. And I haven't read his other books, but I'm sure they're great, because he's just a fantastic author whose research and laying out of everything is mind-blowingly good. And then I lost my train of thought. Sorry. I got excited because it's such a good book. And I really wish that if you like, as we talk about Jonestown being baked in the culture, and there's all these references to Jonestown that are baked in the culture, there's a higher chance that somebody puts on a 2-hour documentary about Jonestown without any other real information.
Mm-hmm.
And so they get that story without any of the context. They don't know how much evidence is missing. They may not know anything about cults, so they don't know that there is evidence to be missing, right? Like, because part of it is like, you said you didn't know a lot about Jonestown, but you could tell something's not right here. Like, the information isn't complete. But if you don't know anything about cults, you're like, I don't know, people in cults are crazy. It makes perfect sense to me. So I just really feel like it's very irresponsible to put it out there, because this isn't something that's like taught in school.
No.
So you need background and you need context to make any sense of the documentary in the first place, because it doesn't really do a good job of making sense of itself.
No.
But also to just say, like, these are the people who were specifically responsible. It takes the responsibility from Jim Jones, which is egregious. And it takes all of the more interesting things out of the story. The things that are interesting to me about cults are how people get involved in them, how they get driven to do the things that they do,
right?
Why people will do things in a cult that they wouldn't do otherwise. And the question that we come back to over and over again, where do we draw the line between their complicity and responsibility for what they did and the fact that they were victims too? And I don't think there is a line. I think it's way more complicated than that. And I think any documentary that wants you to look at the second level or the third level under the leader has a responsibility to address that and not just say, oh no, she wasn't brainwashed. It's like, did you know her personally? How, like,
no,
the
reporter that's doing this, who wrote the book, is making a lot of assumptions. So,
you know what else really tripped me out? This is on my notes because it made me so mad. She's an expert. She's done enough research on Jonestown to come up with this theory that is different from other historians. She is theoretically done a lot of research and knows what happened at Jonestown like the back of her hand. Why did she say they drank Kool-Aid? Because they didn't.
Yeah, my thought was they were trying to make it as what the cultural thought of it is, as opposed to what.
Yeah, but I've heard people do that, right? Where they're like, oh, well, they, blah, blah, Kool-Aid. And then they'll be like, but actually it wasn't Kool-Aid. And if you want me to believe that you are an expert, you would know what they drank.
Yeah.
And it wasn't Kool-Aid.
Yeah. A flawed documentary for sure. So yeah. Why don't we hold on, we got one more comment here. Yep, you're right. We're always learning more.
Well, and Jerry, this is the other thing, is I think that I don't know how hard they tried to get other people on the show, right? Like, they could have asked other historians, other cult experts, other people who'd written on the subject and got a no. I don't know that. But if you get the no, then you have to reconsider if you're making the documentary or not, right? Like, not just, right. I think it's very responsible to tell it from one point of view. And I would hope that like for the small amount of influence Doug and I have on people, that if you watch this documentary, you will move through other documentaries and other sources to get a wider picture, because I'm not in any way saying that these women were good people. They did horrible things. And
Right.
I do believe it is true that he couldn't have pulled it off on his own.
Agreed. And we're both in agreement on the idea that these women definitely had some culpability with this, but we also have to take into account like the sphere of influence that kind of pushed them into that direction and all that stuff. So, yeah. So anyway, yeah, just a few things. There's a million documentaries you can watch. This is not one I think either you and I would suggest watching about Jonestown. I think your point about watching it from one point of view has one caveat to that, and it is it's someone who is right and dead in the middle of it all and came in and had a perspective of this is how it was because I was in the thick of it.
I gotta say though, even in that circumstance, I would want perspectives from other people who were in the thick of it, because 10 people in the same room watching the same exact thing happen have 10 different accounts of what happened.
Fair point. Fair point.
And we even know now, despite the fact that this is so widely used in law enforcement, that eyewitness testimony is incredibly flawed, because it's the thing you're like, when eyewitness testimony matters, it's usually traumatic.
Yeah.
And so I think like, even in a case where it's one person, I would want it to be presented as this is my story, not this is what definitely happened.
Yeah. Yeah. This is how I see it, like having it from the perspective of like, I can't speak for other people, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I could see that. But I think that having someone who's in the thick of it has a lot of value, but agreed that we need other perspectives too. So at any rate, do you have anything else to comment about this particular documentary? Because
I don't think that our next one, because it's one day in Jonestown, it's specifically around that last day where everybody died. I don't think it's going to get into the history. It's not going to get into how we got there in any meaningful way, because, secrets in the name. So I really do encourage people. I love it when you guys come and you have things to say, right? I love it when we get to interact. I love it when you watch things in advance. I would just really encourage people, maybe you don't have time to read or listen to Jeff Gwynn's book. That's not your responsibility. But like dig around a little bit. Listen to a podcast, like read some articles about it, because I think that Jonestown is one of the more interesting examples of how cults work, because it gives us so much information. This is not a situation like even Heaven's Gate or any of the cults we've covered in the past, where like people came in because they were at a terrible place in their life. They came in because they wanted to make a difference. And they got to do that for a really long time before things got bad. Yeah. And so we see how, what I like people to think about, you are not inoculated from being taken in by a cult or somebody who would be a cult leader if they had a wider range of influence. You're not immune to being manipulated. There's a pattern, and the Jonestown pattern is very interesting because it deviates a little bit, but in its deviation, I think it proves a lot of things about how people get sucked in, how they get in over their heads, and how people can be driven to do really horrible things and things that go against, like I said at the start, the human brain is wired for survival. When people are experiencing suicidal ideation, suicidal episodes, that is because they have an illness. It is not something that happens in an otherwise healthy brain. To get to a point where over 900 people killed themselves, whether that was coerced or not, we didn't see evidence of people fighting back. We didn't see evidence of defensive wounds. We didn't see any of that.
Right.
To get people to that point takes a lot.
Yeah.
And Jim Jones got people to do a lot of crazy things. Moving to California was crazy. Moving from California to Guyana was crazy. And it just kept escalating. And I think I think we should if you're interested in cults and the psychology behind it and how people get sucked in and how people do these horrible things, which I think is the important thing about understanding cults, not the sensationalism. It's worth knowing more about Jonestown. It's worth going beyond the cultural touch points and really getting an understanding of what happened and how it happened.
Yeah, I agree, because it is an atypical start from most cults. So, yeah. All right, so this is the one we'll be doing next month, Cult Massacre, One Day at Jonestown, apparently on Hulu. So we'll be delving into that. Hopefully it is better done than the one we watched.
It is National Geographic and not AMC. So I feel like they have a reputation to uphold.
Yep, maybe. So,
but yeah.
All right. Well, Renee, this is, as usual, been fantastic. Even though the documentary was shitty, I got to talk to you about cults. That's always fun for me. So thanks for all this, and hope you feel a little better.
Thank you. You see my nose getting redder as the show progresses.
Yeah, your nose is like Rudolph style at the end here. So all right. Well, we'll see you next month. We will be here on September 4th. I don't have a promo thing at the end, so we will see you then. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.